The Unbearable Lightness of Being would be an odd name for a dog, but it's a great name for a movie. It's also a pretty cool name for a book, I think. The Unbearable Lightness of Being originally was a book by Czech author Milan Kundera. It was published in 1984, and this movie came out in 1988, just before the Velvet Revolution, in which Czechoslovakia would peacefully reject communism. The book and the movie are set earlier in 1968, which is around the time of the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia, during which the communist government there would be greatly strengthened. This movie is about the intimate, psychological, and romantic lives of three young Czechs living through this period. Hypothetically, it's a mature film. Also, I think it was somewhat notable for being a rather erotic film, an adult film in multiple different ways, you could say. It stars Daniel Day-Lewis, Juliette Binoche, and Lena Olin. There are also some appearances by Stellan Skarsgård and Erland Josephson. The movie was directed by Philip Kaufman. I thought I was really going to love this movie. In fact, I was setting out to watch this, not really to do a review on it, just because I thought it would be a great movie that I would enjoy watching. If you know my taste at all, then you'll know that I really like serious, mature, boring films about internal life, about people living with each other through history, about people trying to deal with the uncertainty of the world. This movie seemed like it might do all of these things, and like it might do them with a particular intensity and focus. I also thought this would be a cool companion film to Reds, which I reviewed on the channel a few weeks ago. That's another movie about a young couple experiencing communism. In Reds, the kids like communism. I thought this would give a counterpoint, a contrast to that. Reds is a great movie that I really enjoyed, but there were a few moments where it was a bit too on the nose. I thought that maybe The Unbearable Lightness of Being would be a bit more subtle, a bit more European, perhaps. It is an American movie, but I thought it might be a little bit more refined, have a lighter touch than Reds. The movie is rated 7.3 on IMDb. I thought, man, this is going to be great, because that is a decent rating, but it's just low enough to suggest that this movie is too boring for the average person, right? I started to get really excited. Unfortunately, I hate to say it, but this is not a great movie. It doesn't really deliver on any of the things that I've just mentioned. It might not really even be a good movie. It isn't terrible, but it was a huge disappointment for me, and I'm going to tell you exactly why that is. First, I do want to mention a few positives. The first one is the acting. I already mentioned the cast, and you can see immense cast. Now, don't get me wrong. The characters in this movie aren't very good, aren't very strong, but the acting is pretty good. We've got a young Daniel Day-Lewis, a young Juliette Binoche, and they both have a really strong presence on screen. They're compelling to watch. These days, you might be used to seeing Daniel Day-Lewis, well, maybe not these days, 10 years ago, you might be used to seeing Daniel Day-Lewis playing older people, grizzled people, tortured characters, doing a lot of acting, putting on a lot of accents. Here, he just plays an attractive guy named Tomas, but he does a decent job at that, and he has a somewhat convincing Czech accent, I guess. There's definitely some anachronism in the role. This was something I noticed in Reds, but it's worse here. For whatever reason, when I see Tomas in this movie, I think Jerry Seinfeld. Now, this movie came out before Seinfeld was on the air, but there's something about the mannerisms and the sweaterisms and the sunglassesisms that betrays the 1980s. I know I said this was the positive section. While we're here, I do want to say that, yeah, the character, Tomas, is weak, vague. He has one character trait, basically, which is that every woman within a mile wants to sleep with him. This isn't exactly complex, may or may not be realistic. I don't think it's very interesting. And it kind of undermines the character in some ways. Probably you know what I mean. I'm not saying that characters that movies need to have likable characters. I think it's great when characters have flaws and they wrestle with them, and the audience wrestles with them. The flaws keep them from pinning them down easily. Sadly, Tomas isn't really this kind of a character. He isn't a hero. He isn't an anti-hero. He's just kind of a bland guy who is also a womanizer. Not particularly complex, or possibly way too complex in a way that's just hard to really read at all. Not particularly compelling, ultimately. Maybe some people feel like this is a natural character, very open, not contrived, and I think that this could work in the book, but in the movie, there just isn't much there. As we watch Tomas seduce this long line of women and then carry out affair after affair, he just feels distant. And I think for a lot of people watching the movie today, the balance isn't quite what it would have been when it came out. I think in 1988, this character was supposed to be sort of balanced between being charming, smart, and also sleazy and manipulative. Making a character that you really had to think through, making this balancing act where it goes back and forth, where you watch him do things that aren't so good, and you sort of watch him do things that are nicer or whatever. Today, I'm not really sure that the balance will work for most people. Like I said, my impression of him was just that he seemed distant. I just didn't have much of a sense of this guy, and there was no compelling question about his morality for me. It just seemed distant. Compare this to Reds, where we also have a character who has an affair. But rather than moving farther away from the audience when this happens, I think this actually brings the character closer to us, opens them up more. Interestingly, in Reds, it's a woman who has an affair. That's definitely not the only difference between those two movies, but maybe that helps to put a little backspin on the whole situation and sidesteps some of the more obvious tropes of cinematic morality. Here, we just kind of have a vague guy who is apparently irresistible, not loyal, and to me, it's just not that interesting. So, like I said, this Tomas character, well acted, but not really a compelling character. Juliette Binoche, similar problems in some ways. Her character, Teresa, Juliette Binoche does a great job, extremely compelling, but her character has problems. Different problems, I will say. The introduction to her character is great, and actually the beginning of this movie in general is pretty darn good. The introduction to her character is nice. It has maybe it's almost perfect. It's one of a number of clever moments in the opening stages of this movie. Tomas, who is a doctor, is in some rural spa town doing an operation. He's some sort of surgeon. Afterwards, he's wandering around the spa, and he stops at the pool, where there's a group of men playing chess in the pool. They've got a floating chessboard, and they're sort of floating around and watching. Everybody's focused on the board, laser focused on the chessboard, but then a woman dives in and makes a big splash. The pieces go flying, and there's water everywhere. So who is this brash woman looking to defy traditions? Well, this is a great way to introduce a character, right? This is a great way for somebody to hit the scene. You see the splash, and then you look over, and that's the introduction to a character. And yep, this is Juliette Binoche's character, Teresa. And so in a lot of ways, I love this beginning, but it's actually where some of the problems start from right here. From the beginning, Teresa is a muddled character. It turns out that she's a barmaid at the spa, and she's shy. When she meets up with Tomas, the movie goes to great length to show her as childlike, probably really overplaying the awkward way that she walks and talks. She's meek, hesitant. Meek. It's probably the main word you would use to describe her. So not some brash person who dives into the pool or who doesn't worry about these other things. If you watch the rest of the movie, you kind of wouldn't expect Teresa to get anywhere near this pool. She wouldn't want to disturb anyone. She would look through the door and see that there are people there and think, I'm not going to swim with other people. From the beginning, kind of muddled. Later, she leaves the town to go to Prague, and maybe the idea is that she seems meek but is actually powerful, actually forceful, or maybe the idea is that people oscillate between these two things, between being in control, between being forceful, and also between having nothing, not being able to hold up the weight of the world. I think there's maybe something to that. That may be some portion of what this unbearable lightness of being is about. But when you're watching the movie, the character just doesn't really make a lot of sense. And this is not the only example of this. Later, we learn that Teresa is an artist, a photographer, which kind of comes out of nowhere. You're never exactly introduced to her being a photographer. It's just at some point she's showing her photos to people. For me, it just didn't really ring true. We get some half-baked stuff about art and the importance of art and the process of it later on in the movie. Like I said, it's half-baked. I do think her character has moments. And Binoche is compelling, but overall, it's another one of these characters that probably belongs in a book, and it just doesn't seem very well adapted. A bit hard to understand, and a bit muddled. Okay, so this is the part of the review where I talk about the good things. Like I said, there's a lot of clever little scenes here and there, and the beginning of the movie is actually quite nice. In the first shot, we see a wall with sun on it and shadows. There's distant laughter, and it feels like some kind of nostalgic summer, end of summer memory, or something like that. Then we go to the doctor's office, where Tomas is seducing a nurse. In a twist, it turns out that the other doctors are watching it all through the glass sort of dividing wall. Tomas working in a hospital gives us an important angle, I think. It's a good choice because it shows us an institution. There's a structure here, elements of a society and of a government that interlock with the workplace. And being a doctor, there's also this intimate moral and cultural connotation. And of course, we see from the start that things are a bit seedy. Here's a doctor. He's, this is a profession where you say an oath to be a part of a profession with very high values. And yet here he's using his power for something else. Kind of interesting. Corruption. It's a picture of corruption in some ways. For the most part, this movie seems to be sort of didactic about the corruption of the communist government. The thrust of the movie seems to be that that's bad, but we also see corruption of Tomas more directly and of institutions like hospitals. You wonder if this is a subtlety that is more obvious in the book, and if the movie just sort of turned up the moralism a little bit. It's not uncommon for that to happen, lost some of the dialectical nature of the book. I haven't read the book, by the way. The spa town that Tomas goes to in the beginning is another interesting piece. It's an interesting place. It's a weird place. We wander through the spa and we see in distant rooms, through doorways, we see disjointed bodies, pieces of people bathing, not literally disjointed, but the way it's filmed is kind of eerie, dreamlike in some ways. There's a brass band always playing in the background. I'm not sure if this is looking towards some Soviet ideas with the sort of retreats you'd find in the Soviet Union, or if this is a traditional Czech thing. Either way, it's kind of a nice setting. That said, we never really come back to it, and it's not exactly obvious why it's in the movie. Now, it might not sound like it, but I'm a patient viewer. I don't really mind if we spend time during a movie with something that's just setting the stage or something that's not ultimately too significant. But it is maybe concerning if the entire movie feels a bit inessential. This movie is almost 3 hours long, and it definitely could be a lot shorter. There's a lot of loose ends that if they had gotten the tone of the movie right, if they had gotten the intellectual nature of the movie right, these would not be loose ends. But because, like I said, they just turn up the Hollywood dial a little too much here, these things don't quite have intellectual force to them, and yet they also don't really fit in the story, I guess. Anyway, I was talking about the clever moments, and there are a lot of snappy things in this early section of the movie. Like Teresa says she gets off work at 6, and then we get a hard cut to the clock tower showing 6 p.m. There's a lot of concise stuff like this. It might be time to talk about Philip Kaufman. Apparently, his son is married to Nancy Pelosi's daughter. Not Alexandra Pelosi, but another daughter, I think, which explains a lot about this movie, actually. No, it doesn't. But Kaufman's most famous movie is probably The Right Stuff. I've actually never seen The Right Stuff. I'd like to check it out sometime. He's done a number of other ambitious literary adaptations, ambitious being probably the key word. You got to respect that to some extent. But my impression is that he's kind of in the same generation as Steven Spielberg, and these snappy cuts are part of this American film school generation style, trying to be slick. And it is slick here and there. I don't have too much against it, but there's a big difference between Steven Spielberg and Krzysztof Kieslowski. And there's a big difference between this American feel and the European thing. And one of the issues that lingers over the entire movie, I think, is the odd way that it tries to be an American movie and also a European movie at the same time. And I mean, it kind of feels like drawing a line in the sand here, but the reality is it's trying to pull off some kind of balance that does not work. Like I said, I thought this would have a lighter touch than Reds. I thought it would be more subtle. It is absolutely the other way around. Absolutely the other way around. And you start to see what a difference a decade can make. Reds came out in the early 80s, but is very much a 70s movie, I think. And this feels a lot more like an 80s Hollywood film, unfortunately. So partly there's kind of a mismatch here, a missing identity, which I'll talk more about. But honestly, I also think that Kaufman is a bit out of his depth with this material. Like I've said, this seems like an interesting book, but the movie just consistently misses out on subtlety. It doesn't crystallize the characters. It doesn't really give us a sense of historical place. Its perspectives are predictable, bordering on cliche. You know, in Reds, for instance, there's all these interesting historical moments that you don't really anticipate. All these angles, all these things that happen to people that you wouldn't really, and these aren't really plot twists as much as they're historical twists. This movie is not really like that. It's kind of exactly what you would expect. The movie also has some fairly infuriating technical mistakes in it, honestly. For how little the movie accomplishes, it takes up way too much of your time, and it probably takes itself a bit too seriously. Okay, that's pretty negative. We're supposed to be in the positive section here. Let me give you some specifics. I will say, you know, the movie, it's not all bad. It has some highlights. Like I said, the beginning is okay. It wasn't until 15 or 20 minutes in that I started to get a bit worried about how facile things were. Around an hour and a half into the movie, I think things actually pick up again as well. And there's maybe a 30-minute span of the movie that I actually really liked. This is the only part of the movie that really has this light touch, and where some of the symbols start to feel a bit more meaningful, some of the characters start to feel a little bit more real, more open, compelling. This is the only part that I really cared about. It also has some nice little moments in it. We have a little shot of a cactus, or of two little cacti growing next to each other in a pot. You think, aw, it's a couple. It's a cute little cactus couple living together despite their spines, right? There's a lot of cool kind of pieces in this movie in that section, and this is a part that actually feels like a real movie, basically. Unfortunately, this section dissipates before too long, and the last kind of section of this movie, is probably one of the weakest parts, both kind of the last movement of it, which is, again, just not subtle, but also the very end, which I think for a lot of people will feel extremely cheap and just kind of odd. This movie is episodic, obviously. We kind of drift from one place to another. Reds does something very similar, but I think Reds has two key elements that this movie does not. First of all, Reds captures the passage of time much better. In the unbearable lightness of being, you never really know how much time has passed. Now, I think buried somewhere deep in this movie, there are some ideas about how your life slips by or flies by, and how light that process can be, right? I'm not saying that we should have a clock on the screen that tells us where we are and what time it is. I think a certain amount of temporal slippage is poetic, good, right? But surely part of the story is also about how people get older, how conflicts erode our life, steal our time from us. The characters in this movie don't really seem to age. I honestly don't know how many years pass in the movie. There is a dog that gets older, quite a bit older. I'm not sure how much time passes. In Reds, we also have a loose temporal structure, actually, but it simultaneously gives us a heartbreaking passage of time. Here, we just have the first one, very loose sort of relationship between these different parts. The unbearable lightness of being is also seriously missing consequences. Seriously missing consequences. This might be, I think, one of the biggest flaws of the movie, in my opinion. In Reds, we are following an existential conflict where there are real stakes, where it's important to people, where characters have bet their life, their existence on certain ideas, on doing certain things, where it isn't clear that people will make it out alive, where it isn't clear that people will find each other again. In this movie, characters take risks. You know, they have affairs, they protest this invasion, they leave the country They come back. Their marriage license is malformed. You kind of think that some of these things might establish some sort of precarity, but none of it actually ends up mattering at all. Maybe this is the lightness of being, just drifting along. But it seems really at odds with the historical context of the movie, and it deprives us of a certain glue and a certain just dynamism to the plot. In Reds, the chronology and the consequence really hold the episodes together. Here we don't have either of those, and the movie feels really disjointed, honestly. After about an hour in, there is an abrupt switch in subject, and I honestly almost stopped watching the movie at this point because it just seemed like such a bizarre shift. It just seemed like I'd invested in something, and now we were kind of going somewhere else. Ironically, the best part of the movie isn't too far away. It's just around the corner, but I wouldn't blame you for being confused about the focus of this movie. I've said a couple of times, there's parts that really, it's not clear why they're in it. Like I said, if they'd kind of gotten the intellectual nature of the movie right, maybe these would be more valuable. But to me, it just didn't come off. Speaking of focus, one of the most notable things about this movie is that it has a lot of intimacy in it. Or in other words, a lot of sex. Like I said, I think this is one of the reasons why the movie was kind of notable at the time. Or that's not quite the right way of putting it. I think that's one of the things that maybe helped it gain traction with the mainstream public, right? We actually don't see characters just talk to each other very much in this movie. The film is more like a string of sex scenes, talking about being disjointed, by the way. I've got nothing against this, really. Some of the scenes are corny. Some of them, I think, are compelling. Some of them are great, actually. Nonetheless, it feels like we're kind of missing some crucial pieces of the story. Like this is all the bits that would have been edited out by a movie made by a different director or something. And I don't know, there's some crucial pieces that we're just not really included in, some discussions that there's a couple places where they even kind of allude to some conversations that happened, and you just wonder, like, why is this conversation why is it not in the movie? It seems interesting, it seems substantive, but they show us other things instead. Let me touch on a few very specific things here. When Tomas returns to Czechoslovakia, he's stopped at the border. He hands his passport to the guard. They check his luggage. Tomas asks for the passport back. The guard tells him to wait. Then they check some more stuff, the luggage, and then the gate opens and Tomas drives through. We never see whether he gets his passport back. There's no shot returning to the guard. You know, there's a shot of him handing the passport over. There's a shot of him asking for his passport back and the guard saying no. And then he just drives off. We never see if he gets his passport back. I feel like this can only be described as a mistake. Surely there should be another shot showing him getting his papers back or showing him not getting them back, right? I mean, look, real people, when we travel around with our passports, it's very important. You watch that thing like a hawk. And I feel like when you watch a movie that doesn't show you this piece of information, I don't know, it's bizarre. I don't really understand. Yeah, it's quite strange. To make matters worse, later on, Teresa tells Tomas that she wants to leave Czechoslovakia again. And Tomas says, well, we can't. They took our passports. When, you might ask? We never see this in the movie, unless it's supposed to be at this checkpoint. But Teresa isn't traveling with Tomas at that time, so he wouldn't have her passport, right? Presumably, they must have been taken later on. But why would Teresa not know about this? She wouldn't know that her passport would be taken? It just doesn't really make any sense. And look, in a different kind of movie, maybe this isn't so much of a big deal. But here, given that they kind of set it up with some of this 80s kind of Hollywood feel to some degree. Clear, it's not Top Gun or anything, but like they set it up a little bit with this kind of snappy stuff, and that there just isn't quite the substance you would expect. It's hard to account for just things like this that don't make much sense. Interestingly, this comes right after we get a nice little artistic shot of a river with some swans in it and a park bench drifting downstream. This is supposed to be kind of an intellectual artistic shot. It's supposed to be, it's the movie trying to be a European movie, for instance, which is fine. Look at how the world has become unstuck. The park benches are floating away. Okay, fine, passable imagery, but that's really nothing special, right? And to go from that just kind of vague, whatever imagery, to a plot point that just doesn't make any sense. Yeah. Like I said, we've got a problem here, a movie that is trying to be a Hollywood movie and trying to be a European movie, and kind of ends up failing at both, honestly. The Unbearable Lightness of Being has a number of moments like this where it tries to be kind of European or whatever. I wouldn't say they were egregiously bad. Some of them are fine, but they just aren't anything special. There's a bunch of stuff with a swimming pool, for instance, right? The swimming pool image. Okay. Teresa feeling alienated in a swimming pool. Teresa having a poignant daydream about Tomas in a public pool. Again, alienation. This is fine, but look, it's nothing special. We've seen the swimming pool thing so many times, right? I don't know. There's a character named Sabina, who I've mostly left out of the review just for the sake of time. She has a lot of mirrors, which feels, in all of her apartments, she's got mirrors. She's breaking the mirrors. She's moving the mirrors around. She's got all these oddly shaped mirrors. She's looking at herself in the mirror, which is again, fine, but it just feels a little bit like something you would talk about in a high school English class as symbolism, right? This Sabina character, for whatever reason, looks like she comes straight out of a Bob Fosse movie. I mean, seriously, I don't really know why. These are kind of little things, but really some of the bigger elements of the movie, some of the important ones, have kind of a similar lack of complexity. For instance, there's a lot made out of Prague before and after the Warsaw Pact invasion. By the way, the whole Warsaw Pact invasion in this movie is extremely vague. You see some tanks roll in. Oh, well, first you hear some tanks roll in because you hear sort of distant thunder or whatever. Also, this movie uses the distant thunder, bad thing is going to happen thing, 3 times in this movie. We're trying... Yeah. Let's at least attempt some subtlety or whatever. So one of these is, we see the tanks rolling in, we kind of hear the rumblings in the distance. Okay, what bad thing's about to happen? The tanks roll in, then we get some sort of fake newsreel footage that isn't really particularly convincing. It kind of looks like newsreel footage, but then we see Tomas and Teresa in it in a way that to me just didn't exactly come off. This section is somewhat jarring. To some extent, it plays up the violence and hostility, but it also skips around a fair amount. I don't know, it feels like it's trying to be intense, but also trying to have a somewhat light touch and not making any of the individual scenes not lingering on them, not trying to be too dramatic, right? While at the same time trying to be very dramatic. Why is it all in this fake newsreel style, this black and white stuff? I don't really know. I don't think it adds much. It is interesting that this is very much out of the style of most of the movie. I will say, by the way, to be fair, most of the movie pretty well shot. Looks nice. Anyway, this is kind of the marquee historical moment of the film, the big thing that separates the big before and after, the center point of the movie, and yet we really don't get any information about what is happening. If you didn't know the historical context, you would probably think that Czechoslovakia was invaded by the USSR in 1968. The reality is a lot more complicated than that, and it just feels like, I don't know, just a Reader's Digest version of history. That's not what I was hoping for in this movie. I've said before, I don't think movies necessarily have to be spot on with historical accuracy, but they should pass the smell test, where when you watch the movie, it doesn't seem like you're reading a kid's book, and this movie does not pass that test. Anyway, one of the ideas of the movie is to compare Prague before and after this invasion, right? So we've got a long movie with an intimate focus where we spend a lot of time talking to people, just seeing people have sex with each other, right? This seems like it would be a great opportunity for some really interesting, subtle insights about living during an occupation, but we do not get that. Instead, we get some dying plants, right? They go back to Prague, all the plants are dying. Well, communism must be rough. All the plants have died, right? Paranoia, depression. I'm not saying that the movie should put things in a positive light, and believe me, I have nothing against this movie showing communism as a bad thing. Don't mind it at all. But I just think that we don't get much complexity in this movie. This before and after is exactly what you would sort of predict. If you had to just kind of sketch out the movie without having seen it in a few minutes, you would come up with that. And that, I mean, that's kind of the big theme here. Now, look, I don't know. I think maybe I'm being a little harsh on the movie, but like I said, I had high expectations for The Unbearable Lightness of Being. It has a cool name, what can I say? And it just does not do it. I think there are some themes, some interesting ideas buried pretty deep below the surface. Right? And in some ways, the story has some poignance, right? It's a movie about a lot of incomplete attempts at making a complete life, incomplete attempts at a complete life. But speaking of incomplete, overall, it just does not come together, which is unfortunate. Look, like I said, I honestly thought this would be fun, that this would be one of my favorite movies of the year or something. But hey, it can be hard to predict exactly how things will turn out. I think to some people, or for some people, this actually could be a good fit. It is, I guess, a fairly accessible movie, although you might get bored, and it has some more daring elements in it. But I don't know. I can't really imagine recommending this movie over something like Reds, which is also by no means a perfect movie. But you talk about complexity, you talk about, in characters, in ideas, the ideas about history there, but also the history in the movie and the characters living through it. It's just sort of an order of magnitude more subtle and interesting for me. So anyway, that's a bit of a disappointment. The unbearable lightness of being. I think if you stay tuned for the rest of the year, I'm going to take a few more swings at watching a movie that I actually like, and we'll see if I can do better than this. I hope I can.